Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Nick for planning this. I'm John Taplin, and 6 weeks ago I published a book called Move Fast and Break Things: How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And I suppose that today, when Amazon decided to buy Whole Foods for $20 billion, it's probably a good time to do this. I want to try and relate this to the Oakland music scene and the Oakland DIY art scene as much as I can, because, I kind of understood through Nick some of the challenges you all have. And my background is I came out of the rock and roll business in the late 60s. I was lucky enough to be at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965 when Bob Dylan went electric, and I went to work for his manager, Albert Grossman. And I started working for the band, which was one of the groups, which was the backup band for Bob Dylan. And then when Bob Dylan started to go out on the road again, I was their tour manager, Bob and the band's tour manager. And the band was what I call middle-class musicians. They didn't make a lot of money. They didn't make as much money as the Rolling Stones or Cream, but they did okay. And they could sell 300,000 albums and make a really good living. And that living continued for quite a while. And we stopped making records and playing live in 1978 when I produced the Last Waltz with Marty Scorsese, who had been my partner to make Mean Streets. But the records continued to sell. And then in the 80s, the CD came in, and so everybody renewed their record collection. And so a group like the band had really relevant music sold all over again. And so they continued to make a really good living even after they had stopped touring. And then in 2000, two things happened. One, Napster arrived. And two, my friend Levon Helm, who was the guy drinking the Coke in the back of that picture, who was the singer in the band, got throat cancer. And he couldn't sing, he couldn't do anything, basically. And his record royalties came to a complete halt. It just stopped because of Napster. And so he had no way to even pay for his health care. And that to me seemed ridiculously unfair. And I could go on YouTube and see 3, 4, 5 million streams of the band's music, and the musician who sang those songs was getting nothing. So I began to try and think about how this had come about, that the big platform monopolies were making lots of money off of advertising and the musicians were getting almost nothing. And that young musicians had basically come to the conclusion that they could never make money off their records, that they would just have to be living a life of touring and doing 200 days a year in clubs. And that just seemed to me to be absurd in a world when there are going to be, by the end of next year, 5 billion of these devices in the world, 5 billion. And so you think about the law of large numbers. If you could sell something for 50 cents to 5% of that market, you could make $100 million. So it's not like there's not possibilities. So the beginning of the internet was really a very countercultural project. It's not much different from what you're trying to do here. It was spurred on by people like Ken Kesey and Stuart Brand. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Whole Earth Catalog, but that was a San Francisco-based idea of how to make life off the grid, so to speak. And the Whole Earth Catalog spawned the Whole Earth Electronic Link Well, which was the very first really powerful computer network, even though people were using it on a 28.8 kilobits per second dial-up modem. Those ones, and it was just text. And the whole idea of it was that we need this system to decentralize media and culture. Because in 1968, media consisted of 3 television networks, some radio stations, and a newspaper in any given city. And so the idea of having a decentralized system would be great. And Nick Negroponte, who ran the MIT Media Lab, said we need to decentralize control and harmonize people. So that was the impetus for Tim Berners-Lee and all these people to make this incredibly democratic, decentralized network. But in the late 80s, some young people came out of Stanford University who had a very different idea. And they had been raised on the work of Ayn Rand. So I don't know any of you know who Ayn Rand is, but Ayn Rand is this radical libertarian thinker. And in her novels, there's always some great businessman who is fucked over by the mob, by the people, the demos, right? And so Peter Thiel, who is the main character in my book, one of the main characters, said, I no longer believe that capitalism and democracy are compatible. In other words, he wants capitalism, but he doesn't want democracy. Because democracy is all about people who want stuff, and he thinks that only the 1 or 2% of the people who know anything, that is, the venture capitalists and the super scientists, should be in control. So he spawned a whole group of other companies from his first company, PayPal, which are known as the PayPal Mafia. And the PayPal Mafia now basically runs most of Silicon Valley. And most of them all have the same libertarian, do what you want, don't ask permission theory. So Thiel had 4 rules that he believed this new world of internet businesses would have. First, there would be no government regulation whatsoever on the business. Unlike TV networks or newspapers or anything else, there would be no regulation. Secondly, they wouldn't pay any taxes. So the reason Jeff Bezos has enough money to buy Whole Foods is that for years and years and years, Amazon paid no taxes, so it could sell books against your local bookstore, which had to pay 8 or 9% sales tax. He could sell it with no sales tax. So he could undercut them, and he put 3,500 bookstores out of business, and he put about 2,500 record stores out of business. And so the third part was there should be no copyright. So all of you musicians who actually make stuff and it's your property and you copyright it, you should have no right, from their point of view, to control your intellectual property. So YouTube is this business that's based on you having no ability to take your stuff off of YouTube. You may not want it there, but you have no control to do that. You can file a takedown notice, and it may go down, but 2 days later it'll go right back up again. And finally, Thiel felt that if enough of these businesses got really going, then there would be no competition, because the internet would be a winner-takes-all business. There would be one search engine, there would be one e-commerce giant, there would be one social network giant, and that would be it. And he said in 1990, that Silicon Valley was going to be the center of the US economy. And in 1990, that's before the internet was really going. That's a pretty bold statement. And it turned out to be totally true. So that's the biggest companies in the world in 2006. So ExxonMobil, General Electric, Microsoft, Citigroup, British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell. And here's the largest companies in the world last year. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. So these companies came from zero to the dominant force in the economy in a course of 10 years. So it wasn't that people stopped listening to music or reading books or watching movies or reading newspapers. It's just that the revenue got reallocated from the people who made content to the people who own these monopoly platforms. So here's what happened to the music business. Fell by 72% since 2000. This is what happened to the newspaper business. Fell by 78% since 2000. This is what happened to the book business since the Kindle was introduced. Profits got totally crushed. And this is what's happening to the film and TV business. Because as more and more people get broadband, it's easier and easier to send big files, just as easy as to send little music files, because the musicians were the canary in the coal mine, but now it's happening to everybody. So as I said, it's not like the money went away. The money was there. It's just that it went to these three companies, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And as Peter Thiel said, competition is for losers. If you want to create and capture lasting value, look to build a monopoly. And they were really successful at doing that. In fact, these companies are totally globally dominant. So here's Facebook compared to all the other social networks. Here's Google compared to all the other search engines. Here's Amazon's share of the publishing business. And last year, 85 cents of every new dollar spent in online advertising went to either a Google company or a Facebook company. So 85 cents of every dollar went to one of those two companies. Now, when I say Facebook, I include Instagram, WhatsApp, and the others. And when I say Google, I include YouTube and the other parts of the Google empire. So what's the effect for musicians? So YouTube is actually the dominant platform for streaming audio. As you can see, it has about 55% of the business, and Spotify, Tidal, Deezer, Radio, Beats, Rhapsody, all the others are crushed into the other 48%, right? And yet it only pays about 12% of the revenue into the business. So it's a free rider. So the bargain that Google, YouTube makes with even the most powerful record company is your music is going to be on YouTube, whether you like it or not. The only choice you have to make is, do you want some advertising money or do you not want some advertising money? And if you want some advertising money, we'll dribble out some pennies to you. So if, for instance, one of you was lucky enough to have a song that could get 1 million downloads on iTunes, you or your record company would make $900,000. If you got 1 million streams on YouTube, you would make $900. That's not enough to pay your rent, even in Oakland. So there's one other problem with YouTube that I find, which is this. So this is an ISIS video. It's a game to lure young kids to teach them how to be jihadists. But it's got a Procter & Gamble Bounty paper towel ad on the front of it. Now, we don't know if ISIS was actually getting the money from the paper towel ad, but the fact that it's even there is pretty weird. And when I first started researching this, there were over 40,000 jihadist videos on YouTube. Lots of beheadings, lots of other stuff. And YouTube was not the least bit interested in doing anything about that until Procter & Gamble started complaining that we don't really like our paper towel ads on the front of a beheading video thank you very much, we're getting off of YouTube, right? So YouTube says, well, this is really hard to clean this stuff up. But you notice there's no pornography on YouTube. That's because they have very good artificial intelligence that when someone tries to upload porn to YouTube, it sees a bare breast, it shunts it into a separate queue at which a human looks at it. And if for some reason it happens to be from National Geographic, they let it go up, and if it's not, they put it in the trash. And they could do that with everything. They could do that with your music, they could do that with these ISIS videos, they could control their platform. They just choose not to. So part of the subtitle of my book is that these companies have also undermined democracy. And I think it's kind of important for us to think about the role of Facebook in the news business. So this is a description of the news business by a friend of mine, Ben Thompson. So there's all the publishers out there on the left, and here's all the people here, and in the middle, the choke point is Facebook. Because as the head of Bloomberg says, the list is a lot longer than is publicly known of those sites that have Facebook delivering half to 2/3 of their traffic right now. That means that the New York Times gets 2/3 of their traffic from Facebook. So when Facebook goes to the New York Times and says, we've got a great proposition for you, we've invented this thing called instant articles. And what it's going to do is, instead of linking out from a mobile device to the NewYorkTimes.com, we're going to just keep it inside of Facebook. And that way it would be a much better user experience, and we'll give you some of the advertising money. And it was kind of an offer the New York Times couldn't refuse, right? The Godfather. And they went along with it. And it turned out to be the worst disaster in the history of their digital platform. Because, of course, Facebook doled out a few pennies of ad revenue, but they never got the concomitant buzz when someone went to the New York Times, linked, and then went to another New York Times article where the New York Times got all the advertising money, and went to another one where they got all the advertising money. So it turned out to be a disaster. So the problem really deeply, with this is what happened during the election. So in May 28th, the Washington Post announced Facebook is making some big changes to trending topics, responding to conservatives. So what had happened? Breitbart and Fox News had been pounding on Facebook for weeks and weeks, saying that the people who were curating, the humans that were curating the trending topics, that is, what appears at the top of your feed, were too liberal, that they were censoring right-wing news. And so Zuckerberg gave in and said, okay, I'll take the humans out of the equation completely. I'll let just the computers decide by clicks what gets to the top of the trending topics. And so at that very moment, down there in the center of that chart, that little red dot, Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytica and the people that work for Trump, with their allies in Russia and everywhere else, were ready for that. And the minute they took the humans out of the equation, they deployed hundreds and thousands of bots to hit on the articles, the fake news articles that they had posted, and push them right to the top of the stack every single time, and pushed it to the top of the Google search box and top of everywhere. And it also became a kind of nice business. You've probably heard this story of these kids in Macedonia that were making $10,000 a month manufacturing fake news, right? The Pope endorses Donald Trump. So they'd have this, thechristiantimes.com. And so they'd put up this paper, they'd have a Google AdSense advertising account, they'd have a Facebook page, they'd do it, then they'd bomb it with the bots, and it would go right to the top, and they'd make a lot of money. So Tim Berners-Lee, who's a friend of mine who invented the World Wide Web, said the Google ad system trained them just like you train a dog. You give them more money for the things that were just more clickable, so that they learned that untruth was more clickable than truth. And that became the thing that really screwed our democracy. And it's not over. It will continue. I'm not sure that what happens in Georgia next week will not be affected by this. So I mentioned that these people are libertarians. And the question I want to ask is, what does liberty mean anymore? Is that like the liberty of life, liberty in the pursuit of happiness, or does it mean something else? So this is a book that's very, very popular in Silicon Valley, and it's called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And it's essentially how you can build the next Facebook or Snapchat. And the theory behind it is that kids need a trigger, an investment, a reward, and then a reinvestment. And the reward is, of course, a like, right? And the like can't come every time you post something. It has to be what is called a variable reward. And this theory all comes, I don't know if any of you ever took Psych 101, but you probably heard about the Skinner box, which is this little box where the mouse is in the box, and there's a bar that it clicks on. But the mouse gets a variable reward. If he clicks and got a reward every time he clicked the bar, then he would just click the bar when he wanted to get fed. But if he doesn't know whether he's going to get a reward or not, he just keeps clicking the bar, right? He gets addicted to clicking the bar. And that's essentially what the design of most social networks are. They're to get young people addicted. And, in the lab that I run at USC, we have pretty good evidence that the average, 15-year-old checks their phone about 320 times a day. And mostly that's checking their social network. And that's pretty close to being addiction. So I've made the argument that Google, Facebook, and Amazon are essentially in the businesses of surveillance capitalism. The only thing they really care about is data. They want your data, and they want you to perform as much free labor for them as you possibly are willing to do, to give them more data so they can then package that data and sell it to advertisers. And that's the only business they're in. And so they have lots of new ways of getting more data. So they call them smart speakers, but they're not really smart speakers, they're smart microphones. So the Amazon Echo and the Google Home, these are microphones that are always on in your house if you're naive enough to install them. And the Google Now is basically listening for social cues to sell you more advertising. So if you happen to say to your wife, diapers, bang, there's diaper ads, man, or anything you can mention that might be a product, it will go into your advertising feed. And the reason we know these mics are always on is that 2 months ago, a district attorney in Mississippi had a very bad domestic violence incident happen where a man tried to strangle his wife in the kitchen. And the DA, when the police did their investigation, they were taking pictures of the kitchen where it happened, and there was this Amazon Echo was there sitting in the kitchen. So the DA said, well, let's find out what the Echo had to say about this incident, because the husband was denying it completely. I never did any such thing. And so they subpoenaed Amazon, and Amazon first said, no, First Amendment, the husband has to give you the right to have the access to that. And they said, bullshit, and the wife proved that she had actually bought it and everything. And so they turned over the records, and sure enough, the whole incident was on the Amazon Echo, and nobody had ever said Alexa, please record me strangling my wife. It was on. And it's always on, obviously. So the economists made it really clear what this is all about. Data is the new oil. And 100 years ago, we broke up the Standard Oil Company because it was a monopoly, and we had to rethink that, and that changed things a lot. So here's what I worry about. The trope is that your generation does not care a bit about privacy, that you've given up on that concept and you don't care anything about it. So because I've been on a book tour for 6 weeks, I encounter interesting people. So 3 weeks ago, a neurobiologist came up to me and said, I want you to know about this paper that's been published that shows that this device, the smartphone, can perfectly record the tremors of Parkinson's disease. Because the Parkinson's has a very specific kind of tremor. And it could put it in the same file as the file that says how many steps you climbed yesterday, or how many miles you ran, or whatever. And he said, my worry is that they'll sell that data to health insurance companies or your employer or whatever. And it's supposedly none of anybody's business but yours. But it's out there. And nobody is really trying to protect that stuff. So 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference called the Code Conference, which is a big tech conference, and Consumer Reports was there. And they said to me, well, you think that your driving insurance rates, your car insurance rates, are set based on how well you drive, right? Whether you have accidents or not. But it's not. It's set on where you drive. So let's just say 2 women live side by side in Brentwood, California, which is a nice suburb, right? But one of them drives down to teach at a poor school in Watts, and the other just drives around the nice suburb. The woman who drives down to Watts every day probably has a 20% higher car insurance rate than the other woman. So how does Allstate figure that out? This. So, and you've all gone on your location privacy settings and know it's told you where you've been in the last week. And so this is nothing new, but you have to think about the economic effects of that. It could be, in 5 or 10 years, to get health insurance, you'll be required to wear a Fitbit. And that will record your heart rate and will record maybe even your blood diabetes level, all sorts of other things, and send it wirelessly every morning to the health insurance company. So we're headed down this trail where these people who think, well, this is good, this is all helpful, this is making people be healthier or something. But it's not necessarily true. I use the word technodeterminists in my book. These are people who think they know better than you do how the world should work. And they've gone and they've destroyed the business for musicians, the business for people who are in the news business. There are 50% fewer people making a living in journalism today than there were 10 years ago. And now they want to set out to do all sorts of other things. So I was at this same code conference. Mark Andreessen, who is this big venture capitalist, said that he was pretty confident that in 10 years, every big truck would be self-driving. So the interviewer said, okay, so you're going to put 4 million working class men out of business who are in their 40s and 50s. And what are you going to do about that? And his response was, it's not my problem. I'm here to invent the future. It's the politician's problem. But the politicians aren't thinking about this at all. Here's why I think I know this. So I was involved last year in a series of hearings run by this woman who was the Registrar of Copyrights for the United States. And she was concerned, because she is in charge of the copyrights, that musicians need more protection. And we need to have perhaps what we're calling a take down, stay down law. In other words, if you said to YouTube, I want you to take my song off of YouTube, then it becomes YouTube's responsibility to keep it off their platform, not yours. So you don't play this game of whack-a-mole. So she had these hearings, and she invited YouTube and Google and Facebook and everybody to be there. And at the end of these hearings, she concluded publicly that there should be a change in the law. And 3 days later, she was fired by the Obama administration, by the way. And the Wall Street Journal wrote, so you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to notice that the abrupt change of leadership at the US Copyright Office is good news for Google, which aims to pay less for profiting from the property of others. So I'm here to tell you that there is a beginning of a resistance against this regime. And the resistance is starting in the music community. Because as long as there is a YouTube that puts all your music out for free, you never can have a vital streaming service that pays musicians. So the difference between what YouTube pays and even what Spotify pays is quite a lot. And the difference between what Spotify pays on its ad-based service and what Spotify pays on its premium service is a big amount. So if we could have a business, and just so you know, when Spotify made its business plan available to the big music labels, it said that by 2017, 75% of its users would be on the premium tier. It's 25% of its users. And the reason that is because YouTube sits out there having everything for free. So the resistance starts with musicians. And maybe we have to think about antitrust. This is an idea that has been dead for almost 30 years in America. And yet, I make the argument in my book that it was responsible for all the innovation of the digital age. So in 1956, long before any of you were born, there was a monopoly phone company called AT&T, the Bell system. There was only one phone company in America. And in return for them being a monopoly, the government said to them, you have to license for free every patent that you own in your research and development subsidiary called Bell Labs. And it just so happens that Bell Labs had invented the transistor, the microchip, the laser, the cellular system, the satellite, and basically every other piece of the digital age. And so out of those patents, free patents, came a huge group of new companies. Texas Instruments, Motorola, Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, ComSat, all these new companies came up because they were able to take free patents and start new businesses. So maybe Google has to take all its patents and give them away for free instead of suing people over autonomous cars or advertising patents or Google Earth patents or whatever they have. The second big antitrust suit was IBM. So in the early 60s, IBM had a complete lock on the computer business. They made the hardware, the software, everything. And the government sued them. And the suit dragged out almost 15 years. And during that time, IBM started to develop the personal computer. And because the government had put so much pressure on them, they said, okay, if we're going to make this new thing, we'll let these two young kids from Seattle make the software, Paul Allen and Bill Gates, and we'll let these other young kid, Andy Grove, his new company, Intel, make the chip, and we'll just be the seller and make the rest of it. So we all know where that ended up, right? And then finally, the Microsoft antitrust decision, which was about the browser, right? So the browser, what Microsoft wanted was to, if you had a Windows computer, which at that time had 90% of the market, you had to use Internet Explorer. So if they had won that, there would never have been a Google, right? There would be nothing. So out of that thing came another explosion of new innovation. So I'm going to just make the argument that antitrust is not a bad thing. That antitrust, and maybe if we break up these companies, some innovation can come. So I'm going to stop here and just suggest that what I'm interested in hearing from you guys, and I'm going to just come down here and talk to you, not talk down to you, is to figure out how we get your generation begin thinking about these issues in ways, and maybe it doesn't resonate to you, maybe it does, but how we get people to think about that they have a stake in not having three companies rule the world. Okay? Thanks.